If you walked into a British school in the 1950s, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be a single object. It would be the atmosphere, the smell of chalk dust and floor polish, the quiet pressure of rules that didn't need explaining because everyone already knew them. The way a classroom could feel like a small, organised world, one adult at the front, 30 children expected to sit straight, listen, and behave as if behave was a subject you could fail. And if you walked into a British school in the 1970s, you'd still recognise that world, just with cracks starting to show. Different hair, different music outside the gates, different attitudes slowly arriving, but the spine of school life, discipline, routine, uniforms, assemblies, dinners was still there. This is the real story of British school life from the 1950s to the 1970s. What it felt like day to day, what the rules actually did to children, how class and opportunity shaped everything, and why this era is remembered with a strange mix of nostalgia and relief. Because people don't just remember the lessons, they remember the system. They remember how it made you feel. To understand that system, you have to start with one huge post-war reality. Britain didn't just rebuild cities after the Second World War, it rebuilt childhood. The big shape of school life in the 1950s was heavily influenced by the post-war education system that aimed to sort children early, by ability, by future, by what the country thought you were for. At around age 11, many children faced the famous 11+ exam, and this wasn't a small test that came and went. For a lot of families, it felt like the first fork in the road of a child's entire life, because the idea was simple. At 11, you would be placed into one of different types of secondary schools, most commonly grammar school or secondary modern. A third type, technical schools, existed in theory but were far less common in practice. And once you were placed, the world you entered could be completely different. Grammar school usually meant academic subjects, examinations, and a clearer path toward higher education and professional work. Secondary modern often meant a more practical curriculum and, for many pupils, fewer formal qualifications. That division wasn't just educational, it was social. Two children could live on the same street, wear the same uniform, and walk through the same gate at 11, and then be sent to completely different futures. So imagine what that did to a child's mind. In your last years of primary school, you weren't only learning, you were being measured. Some schools drilled for the exam. Some parents pushed hard. Some children barely understood what was happening until the result arrived like a stamp on their forehead. And when the result came, it didn't just decide the next school, it decided how teachers, relatives, and sometimes even the child themselves would interpret their own intelligence. That's why so many people remember it so clearly, even decades later. Now, step into the daily routine. British school life in this period had a rhythm that was almost military, not because it was literally military, but because it relied on repetition, hierarchy, and obedience. Most children wore uniforms, not always fancy ones, but uniforms that made you feel part of a system. Shirts, ties, blazers, jumpers, skirts, trousers, satchels, black shoes, and uniforms did something important. They erased choice. You weren't there to express yourself. You were there to fit in, follow rules, and become proper. Then the bell, and the day began. In many schools, the morning started with assembly, rows of children, heads facing forward. Often a hymn, often a prayer, a teacher speaking from the front, notices, warnings, praise, reminders of what kind of behaviour was expected. To a modern viewer, it can feel strange. Why so formal? But in that era, school wasn't only about information. It was about shaping you into a certain type of citizen. And then you'd march or file back to class, and the real business started. Classrooms in the 1950s and early 60s could feel strict, even when the teacher was kind. You stood up when the teacher entered. You didn't call adults by their first name. It was Sir and Miss and Mr. And there were unwritten rules you learned quickly. Don't interrupt. Don't answer without being asked. Don't embarrass the teacher. Don't embarrass yourself. Lessons were often built around memorization, copying, reciting, and repetition. Handwriting mattered. Spelling mattered. Times tables mattered. And the teacher's authority wasn't a suggestion. It was the engine that kept the room functioning. Because if the teacher lost control, the whole system looked weak. And weakness was not respected. Now let's talk about the thing everyone brings up when they hear British school in the old days: discipline. This is where the stories get intense, because discipline wasn't a side detail. Discipline was a philosophy, and it operated at multiple levels. The mild level was public embarrassment, being told off in front of others, being moved, being singled out, being made an example. The next level was extra work, lines, writing the same sentence again and again, or detention, being kept behind after school. And then there was corporal punishment. In many schools, especially earlier in this period, physical punishment was legal and widely used, particularly for boys. The cane became the symbol of that system. Even if you never received it, you often knew it existed. You saw it. You heard about it. You felt the fear of it sitting in the air like a warning. And that fear shaped behaviour. You could argue about whether it worked, but there's no debate about what it did psychologically. It made school feel high stakes in a way that went beyond grades. Because if mistakes or attitude could become punishment, then your body stayed alert all the time. And what's important is that not every teacher used it the same way. Some teachers were calm, controlled, respected. Some were unpredictable. And in a child's world, unpredictability is terrifying. This is why people who look back on that era split into two types. Some say, we needed discipline. Others say, we lived in fear. And both can be true, depending on the school, the teacher, the home, and the child. Then there were the rules that shaped the social life inside the building. Hair had to be tidy, uniform had to be correct, shoes had to be polished. In some places, even the way you walked, spoke, or sat could be corrected. It sounds extreme until you understand the goal. The goal was order. In the post-war years, order was seen as stability, and stability was seen as survival. Now, outside the classroom, one of the most memorable parts of British school life was the midday meal, the school dinner. This is where British childhood becomes instantly recognisable. The dinner hall, the noise, the smell, the queue, the dinner ladies, the trays, and the food that people still argue about today like it was a national experience. Because for many children, school dinner wasn't just lunch, it was a daily ritual. In the post-war system, school meals weren't treated as a random cafeteria option. Local authorities had a duty to provide a midday meal, and those meals were designed with nutrition in mind, not because they were always tasty, but because they were meant to fuel a growing body. And if you grew up in that era, you remember the classics: roast dinners on certain days, meat and 2 veg, cabbage that seemed to be everywhere, mashed potatoes, gravy, fish days, puddings with custard, semolina or rice pudding that people either loved or feared. Some kids couldn't wait for pudding. Some kids learned the skill of trading food. Some kids learned the even more advanced skill of hiding food to avoid being forced to finish it. And yes, forcing children to clean your plate was common. Food waste wasn't a moral debate. It was simply wrong. That attitude didn't come from nowhere. It came from war memory, rationing memory, and the idea that food was something you respected because it could disappear. Another huge childhood detail from this era: school milk, little bottles, often left out, sometimes warm, sometimes not exactly pleasant. But it wasn't optional for many pupils. It was part of the routine, tied to the post-war belief that children's nutrition was a national priority. And this is where you see history changing in a single policy shift. By the early 1970s, the universal approach began to tighten. The government ended free milk for many older primary school children, keeping it for younger ones. That change became so culturally famous, it produced one of the most iconic schoolyard chants in modern British political memory. And what that tells you is simple. School life wasn't only about teachers and kids. It was about the state deciding what childhood should include. Now let's talk about the rules outside lessons, because school isn't only classrooms. It's PE, it's sports, it's changing rooms, it's the playground. And in the 1950s and 60s, PE could feel harsh. Not always cruel, but tough. Cold fields, shorts even when it felt freezing. Cross-country runs, gymnastics in echoing halls, plimsolls, and a very strong idea that discomfort built character. School sport also carried social ranking. If you were good at football, you mattered. If you weren't, you learned where you stood very quickly. And in many schools, boys and girls were pushed into different expectations. Boys, toughness, competitiveness, don't complain. Girls, neatness, posture, certain sports seen as appropriate. These were not neutral choices. They shaped how children saw their own bodies and what they believed they were allowed to be. Now zoom out again, because the biggest difference between the 1950s and the 1970s wasn't a single rule. It was the direction of society. In the 1950s, Britain still carried a strong sense of deference. Respect authority, trust institutions, don't cause trouble. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, that certainty began to loosen. Comprehensive schools expanded in many areas, reducing selection at 11. Youth culture became louder. Classrooms slowly became less formal in some places. Not everywhere, not overnight, but enough that children felt the shift. And then there was the age question. For much of this era, many pupils could leave school at 15. That meant school had a built-in ending point. You've done enough, now go work. But in the early 1970s, the school leaving age was raised from 15 to 16. That change might sound like a simple extra year. In reality, it changed the entire experience for thousands of kids. Because if you're the kind of student who loves school, another year can be opportunity. But if you're the kind of student who already feels trapped, another year can feel like a sentence. Schools had to find space. They had to handle bigger numbers. They had to deal with 15-year-olds who used to be earning money, now sitting in classrooms asking, "Why am I here?" That created tension. And it created a very specific atmosphere in the 1970s. A sense that school was becoming more universal, more controlled, and more complicated. So what was the reality of British school life in the 1950s to 70s? It was not one experience. It depended on class. It depended on region. It depended on whether you passed the 11+. It depended on the type of school. It depended on whether your teachers were supportive or harsh. It depended on whether school felt like a ladder or a label. For some children, school was a route out, a way to win scholarships, pass exams, reach grammar school, and step into a professional future their parents never had. For other children, school was a place where you were sorted early, given lower expectations, and taught, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, that your role was to follow, not to lead. And then there's the emotional truth that almost everyone recognises. School taught you the rules of society. Not only the written rules on the wall, the real rules. Who gets listened to? Who gets punished? Who gets praised? Who is expected to succeed? Who is expected to just get on with it? That's why British school life in this era still triggers such strong reactions. Because when adults talk about it, they're not only remembering classrooms, they're remembering the first time they felt judged, the first time they felt pride in a good report, the first time they felt humiliation, the first time they realised the world didn't treat everyone the same. And if you want the final truth, the thing that makes this story hit, it's this. British schools in the 1950s to 70s were designed to produce order. Sometimes that created stability. Sometimes it produced confidence. Sometimes it built strong routines and strong communities. But sometimes it produced fear. Sometimes it produced silence. Sometimes it decided a child's future before the child had even learned who they were. And that's why people still argue about it today. Not because they're arguing about nostalgia, because they're arguing about what school is supposed to do. Is it supposed to sort children? Or is it supposed to open doors? Is it supposed to enforce obedience? Or is it supposed to build curiosity? Is it supposed to make you fit the system? Or make the system fit you? And maybe the fairest way to end is this. British school life in the 1950s to 70s wasn't a movie. It was real. It was strict. It was routine. It was uniforms, assemblies, dinners, lines, and rules. For some, it was a ladder. For others, it was a wall. And for almost everyone who lived it, it was unforgettable. Because it didn't just teach you subjects. It taught you how Britain worked,